Thank you for joining us for the second part of our exploration of the US Mosque Survey led by Dr. Ihsan Bagby. Before I go any further, first I'd like to acknowledge that today is the day of Ashura for many of us. Some of us recognized it yesterday, depending on your method of calculation. And I'd like to first say that we want to acknowledge the day and offer a prayer that Allah grant us victory over all tyranny. For today's discussion, we will be taking another deep dive into the American mosque. From mosque opposition on a local level to presidential candidates calling for surveillance of American mosques, Muslim houses of worship are often discussed as risks to be mitigated rather than vibrant centers of American faith. But today we're going to do things a little differently. We're going to take a step back and we're going to cut through the misinformation and bring you the facts. The US Mosque Survey, the only study of its kind, documents the growth and development of American mosques, providing a national portrait of both Sunni and Shia houses of worship. The purpose of the US Mosque Survey is to provide scientific and a detailed portrait of the American mosque in order to dispel misconceptions, but also, and most importantly, to help mosque leaders and participants build together a better, more vibrant, more engaging mosque. All the US Mosque surveys, starting from the year 2000, were conducted in collaboration with the larger study of American congregations called Faith Communities Today, or FACT, which is a project of the Cooperative Congregational Studies Partnership, a multi-faith coalition of numerous denominations and faith groups, headquartered at Hartford Seminary. The strategy of FACT is to develop one common questionnaire and then have the member faith groups use that questionnaire to conduct a survey of their respective congregations. The US Mosque Survey took the FACT common questionnaire and modified it to fit the unique mosque context. The primary sponsors of the US Mosque Survey of 2020 include the Islamic Center, the Islamic Society of North America, the Center on Muslim Philanthropy, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies. Now, with no further ado, we're going to jump into the results of the study led by Dr. Ihsan Bagby, who is an associate professor in the Department of Islamic Studies at the University of Kentucky, whose research focuses on Muslims in America. In 2001, he published the results of the first comprehensive study of mosques in America, entitled The Mosque in America, A National Portrait. Based on the 2001 study, Dr. Bagby published a series of articles diving deep into the data. He also served as primary investigator on ISPU's Reimagining Muslim Spaces project. Dr. Bagby received his PhD in Near Eastern Studies from the University of Michigan with a specialty in Islamic law.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. It's my pleasure to be here with such a wonderful panel. And I hope we can try to understand and draw some type of conclusions, even recommendations from the data. The purpose of the US Mosque Study 2020 and the ones we did in 2000 and 2010 were to, one, dispel misinformation about masajid in America, but also, and maybe from my point of view, more fundamentally to try to help mosque leaders and others who are involved in mosques to improve, to strengthen, to grow their masajid. Because I truly believe that masjids are at the heart of our community and their health is absolutely essential to ensure our future. Let me go as quickly as possible through the slides. For some reason, it's not moving. Sorry. There we go. Let me just mention that the methodology of the study followed rigorously the science of sample surveys. And we had a wonderful research team that guided the project from beginning to end. But let's get right into the findings. For one, we asked a question about approaches, Islamic approaches. And we gave them 5 different choices. And the results show that mosque leaders are basically split, roughly split between what I would call a more moderate approach, and that is the top one in the graph. So the question was, how do you make Islamic decisions? So one option, refer to Quran and Sunnah and look to its purposes, the maqasid, and modern circumstances, which could be called a contextual approach. And as you can see, from 2020 to 2010, it didn't change, so 55%. So the majority, the slight majority of masjid leaders follow this approach of looking to the purposes in modern circumstances. But roughly the same amount, a little less, but roughly evenly divided are mosque leaders that follow what I would call a more conservative approach, and then they look to the past. The second category there on your screen, refer to Quran and Sunnah and look to the great scholars of the past, so 39%, and that grew. The next choice, follow a particular madhab, and there you see some movement from 2010 to 2020. So in 2010, 11%, and now in 2020, just 4%. And apparently those that 11% have moved into second category, looking to the great scholars, which you might think of as a multi-mazahib approach. And we'll see that these approaches do seem to affect the outcomes of different questions. So this issue of Islamic approach seems to be relevant for understanding why masajid choose to do something or not do something. But what is very clear and very gratifying is that all of the possible choices do not affect whether mosque leaders agree that Muslims should be involved in civic institutions and should be involved in American politics. It really doesn't matter. As you can see, the green is strongly agree, and the brown is agree. So add those together right there, you have 98%. unbelievable, really, when you think about it. Virtual unanimous. And you see rise amongst all the approaches, all of the Islamic approaches in terms of involvement. Here, involvement in American politics. But you do see that, for instance, the group of mosque leaders that hold the view that you should look at the purposes of the law, they have a much higher percentage that strongly agree. So on the far left, the orange, 85%, are those mosque leaders who follow the purposes, the maqasid, and so 85% of them strongly agree, and that's higher than the other approaches. So again, to make sure you understand, this particular chart is looking at those who strongly agree, not just agree. So there is no difference when you look at just agree, but when you look at strongly agree, there is a difference that appears between the different approaches. It's still very strong. Another question to get a sense of how masjid leaders view American society, and also maybe a question of alienation. The question was, do they view American society as immoral? And what this shows is that the gray on the top is agree. Hardly anybody strongly agree, but 18%. So that is relatively low. But you do notice that from 2010, look at the brown, 49% disagree. Well, that went down in 2020, and some went to strongly disagree, but also many went to neutral. So if you notice, the orange in 2020 is 31%, and the neutral climbed from 21% in 2010. So here are some of the major findings, and they're all very positive. Report 1 and now report 2 depict a masjid community that is healthy, from my point of view, is on the right track. They are on the right path. And here we charted activities of masjids. And one nice finding, if you look in the middle of the chart, women's groups. So the orange is this particular, this percentage of masjids have this activity. So women's groups are now in 55% of all masjids, and that's a remarkable increase from 2010 when it was 32%. Also, youth groups, the majority of masjids, the slight majority of masjids now have youth groups. Again, very encouraging signs. Nearly half of masajid score high in these basic, what I would call basic masjid activities, regular salah, weekend school, educational classes, youth activities, women activities. So what the chart says, the green, 46%, so almost half of masjids score high in this particular aspect. And by the way, all the approaches, there's no distinction in terms of approach, whether it scores high or whatever. Size matters. So the larger the masjid, the more likely that they have high score in this particular aspect. Masjids, in terms of community involvement, are doing well. Almost 3/4 of masjids are involved in educational interfaith activities. Masjids are also doing well when it comes to other activities of community involvement, food pantry, involvement in social justice activity, health education program, These are all very healthy, and by the way, much greater percentages than churches. However, when you look at whether the masjids score high or medium or low in terms of community involvement, you see the green 29%. So only 29% score high. And this is, in a sense, the target or where we need to improve. Now, what this next chart says is that basically the approach of the masjid, whether looking to purpose, looking to the past, does affect community involvement. So the very top bar, you see, look to the purposes, 37% score high, and this is the highest amount of all the approaches. Now, in terms of political involvement, again, we see a very healthy situation. And one of the points is that, and this is the middle bar, host or conduct voter registration. Almost half of masjids do voter registration. And one surprise, we had a new question: has a politician visited and talked to Muslims in your mosque? And almost half of masajid have had a politician visit them, and this is very much higher than churches. But when you look at a scale of how well masajid are doing in terms of political involvement, you see the green, only 25% now. So the highest percentage for a high score are the basic masjid activities, next is community involvement, and the lowest is political involvement. And this sets kind of a goal of where we need to aspire to in our masjids. And running out of time, so let me quickly talk about issues of women. And I must say, personally, this was a great disappointment. I expected to see movement in the question of whether a masjid gives choice to women, whether they can pray in the musalla, the main musalla, without a barrier, or a choice of whether they want to pray behind a barrier or in another room. And the percentage has not changed since we first asked that question in 2000. So 2/3 of masjids have a barrier or divider that do not allow women to see the imam during the Jummah khutbah. A note to this is that African-American masjids do much better in terms of not having a barrier. So you see 2/3 of masjids have, 2/3 of African-American masjids do not have a barrier. Also interesting that masjids with high community involvement, so they are very focused on outreach and doing things in their community, they are less likely to have a divider. So you see high involvement masjids on the top, 54% of them do not have a barrier, as compared to low involvement at the bottom, 22% have no divider. And also the Islamic approach affects whether a masjid has a divider or not. So the masjids that look to the purposes, the maqasid, are less likely to have a divider. As you see on the very top, look to the purposes, 49% do not have a divider. However, 51% do have a divider, and So this is an issue that needs to be better explored. One of the positive things that came out of the 2020 study is the increased participation of women on mosque boards. So you see in 2020, 67% of masjids have a sister on the board. Only 7, to the far right, you see the orange, only 7% do not allow a woman on the board. And if you look at the other bars, 2010 and 2000, in 2000, the orange, 31% did not allow women on the board. So you see clear, significant progress in this particular issue. Again, the purposes seems to affect the issue of whether a woman, a sister, sits on a board. Those masjids that look to the purpose score much higher. 79% of them have a sister on the board, but also high involvement, whether community or political involvement is also a indicator that a masjid has women on the board. In fact, 87% of masjids that score high also have a woman on sister on the board. Juma attendance, just like the issue of divider, has remained basically the same since we first asked this question in 2000. And we, in 2010, myself with Sister Aisha Adawiya and Sister Sarah Saeed, we developed a women-friendly scale, a masjid that is women-friendly, is based on 4 different variables. And you see some progress. 2010, the green 14% were excellent, scored high. In 2020, 19%. So very modest movement, and there is a lot that needs to be done. If anything, this is the one kind of obstacle, or is not such good news for masajid, and really calls on us to address this issue. Again, approach seems to be involved in whether a masjid is women friendly. So those masjids that look to the purposes score much higher in the percentage that have are women friendly. And we'll stop there. I think I have used up my time. Thank you so much, everybody. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bagby. Every time I hear you speak, even though I've read the, the report many times, I learned something. So fascinating results. We're very fortunate to have this study. I'm going to start by bringing in our panelists, starting with Dr. Ingrid Matson. Dr. Matson is the founder and director of the Hurma Project, a project addressing spiritual and sexual abuse in Muslim spaces. The Hurma Project is committed to upholding the sacred inviolability of each person who is present in Muslim spaces by elucidating the special responsibilities of those holding power and authority, and by educating those who are vulnerable about their God-given dignity and rights. She is the former president of ISNA and holds the London and Windsor Community Chair in Islamic Studies at Huron University College at Western University in London, Canada, and has held that chair since 2012. So I will start with you, Dr. Matson. We just learned about the report findings regarding women and what has changed and what remains the same. What do you think should be something that gives us hope? And what do you think is most urgent for us to address for the future?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sister Dalia, and thank you, Dr. Ihsan, for that presentation. I've followed these reports for many years, especially since I used to teach at Hartford Seminary, so I'm familiar with the methodology and this, the broader report that comes out every 10 years. And it is just such a, it's so interesting to watch these things. I guess the first thing I want to say is that let's all recognize that women have been agents of change for their own situation. Muslim women have been advocating, fighting, arguing, writing, pushing, all over America in mosques and communities for these changes. So any of these improvements that we see, let's make sure that we recognize that women have primarily been the agents of these change, as well as those men like Dr. Bagby, who are, you know, awliya with us. So together, Muslim men and women have been pushing for these, but primarily it's been women who have really for decades been pushing for more agency, more access to space, more respect, more dignity, and that it takes a lot of energy. And so that energy, when we're fighting for just a basic, you know, basic rights, it means it can't be put into other things. But what's really interesting to me is to see the relationship between the increase in interfaith activities, civic engagement, political engagement. You know, I think it's quite clear to me when we see that in the increased participation of women on mosque boards, for example. We know that there's a cause and effect both ways, because as American Muslim communities have realized or have wanted to be more involved in society in order to be known as Muslims, so that our values and who we are known to our neighbors, and also so we could be effective agents of change. Our community saw that there were so many women who could contribute to this, you know, women with knowledge, energy, and just so many ways to participate. So women have been so valuable, not only in, you know, organizing themselves, but also in raising up. As we've become more part of the community and part of the community leadership, our mosques have also become more dynamic and effective agents of change in the broader society. So I think that's really important for us to recognize that. It is very, you know, it's sad that we still have a number that only half of mosques are considered to be either excellent or good in being women friendly. And I really think we need to dig down more and maybe do some more in-depth studies. How is that unfriendliness manifest? Is it in the sermon? Is it the way women are spoken about or spoken to? Is it in the architecture and the layout? So for example, with the barrier in the mosque, and if it is a barrier that is completely makes one group invisible or invisible to the other, that is very significant. And I very often have my imam or chaplain students practice giving a talk first in front of men and women where they can see both of them. And then we put one group or the other group behind a barrier where they're invisible. So we put the men in a place where they're invisible, and then the women where they can't be seen. And we just ask the imam, you know, or the preacher in that situation, like, how do you feel in terms of your connection with the congregation and the community? So those physical barriers, and they always remark that it makes a big difference. So those physical barriers, it's not just about being in a different space or not being able to communicate back, but it's also about feeling that sense of connection and that we are, like, we're together, feeling compassion, feeling empathy. So I do think we need to have a look at those things. You know, what is the most important in women's experience in terms of whether they feel their community is friendly or unfriendly? So we could also look at So the sermon, the architecture, the layout, the governance, also the programming, how is it planned and presented? Are there accommodations for women who very often are the primary caregivers of their children? So they may want to come to a program, but the way it's timed, they aren't consulted on the timing of it, or there aren't facilities for, say, babysitting or daycare, so they really can't participate. And then I thought it was really interesting looking at the marriage and family counseling, and that really relates to what I do with the Hurma Project. So 78% of mosques provide family and marital counseling services, which is usually the job of the imam. And the report said that's gone down a little bit since the last time. And frankly, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because from my observation, one of the main places where women feel harmed in the mosque is often in marriage and family counseling. If the imam is the counselor and is someone who has not been professionally trained, you know, an organization like Peaceful Families Project does amazing training for imams, so that imams understand how they can be helpful to a family rather than harming the family. And so often women have disclosed that they feel that they've been harmed by the counseling that they've experienced in their mosques, their marriage and family counseling, when their point of view just is denied, or, you know, misogynistic or stereotypical kind of explanations are given, or maybe harm that they experience is just being minimized or denied. So I think that's a really important area to look at. And one of the important things is for us to understand, again, and I really hope, I would hope as an area of growth is, while many in the community do want to go to the imam for spiritual guidance, this is another place, as with mental health counseling, where having the imam partner with a professional who can be a woman to bring some gendered balance into the perspective on what a family might be experiencing gives us a new opportunity. And I'm, you know, again, this is speculation based on my own experience as well as what I see in the report. But I do think one area for mosques to be more women friendly would be specifically in this area. And that would be not just training the imams, because they already have a lot to do, but bringing in services, Muslim services or professionals, many of whom can be women, to facilitate in this area and to bring some balance, some openness, and some more support for women and their experiences and perspectives. I see a question there, and I will type the.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Matson. And we'll have time for Q&A after after the panel discussion. But very important points about the role of women as mental health professionals in partnership with the imam. And you're absolutely right. What we found in our research from the perspective of asking the general Muslim population is that the imam is the first stop for folks when they have a problem in their family. So it's incredibly important to have that kind of training. I'd like to now bring in Dr. Besheer Mohamed, who is a senior researcher at Pew Research Center. He's an expert on the views, demographics, and profile of and size of the US Muslim population. Dr. Mohamed has appeared in numerous media outlets and regularly briefs policymakers, academics, and other important stakeholders. Dr. Mohamed, for you, I'd love to ask you to share with us your reaction to the report, and where do the findings put American Muslims compared to other faith communities in the general public, as well as how American Muslims compare to Muslims globally?
So my initial reaction to this report, as with the previous two, is just to be really impressed. I mean, it's just such a valuable asset to have this sort of careful study of the masajid, both counting them and also interviewing imams and getting their perspectives on a whole host of issues. What we see is our interviewing with Muslims individually tracks pretty closely to some of the things that we're seeing. So, questions about, we've asked questions about whether traditional understandings of Islam need to be interpreted in light of current events, or whether there's more than one true way to interpret the teachings of Islam, or how satisfied people are with their local masajid, or just a simple question of whether or not people are attending religious services. And we also have consistently seen this gender split. In the report, of course, it highlighted the fact that men are make up a much larger percentage of the people in the mosque pretty consistently. And in our studies, we've also seen the same pattern where men are much more likely to attend the mosque regularly. Now, how does that compare to other faith groups in the US? Compared to Christian groups, it's a pretty radical difference. Whether you're looking at Catholics or evangelical Christians, mainline Protestants, historically Black Protestant denominations, in all of those groups, what you see is women are much more likely than men to attend religious services. And this is also in groups, some of these groups, where women can't be the lead preacher, can't be, in Catholicism, they can't be ordained. Despite that fact, we see these patterns where women are more likely than men to attend religious services in these various across a number of these Christian groups. Now, Jews, of course, is the other large group in the United States. They're a little different, because the fact is that attending religious services regularly is pretty uncommon for Jews in the US across the board. And so it's pretty hard to see gender differences when the baseline is only about 1 in 10 American Jews attend religious services regularly. If you look over to data, for example, in Israel, though, we do, where there's Orthodox make up maybe 1 in 5, Orthodox Jews who tend to be more religious make up about 1 in 5 maybe Jews in Israel, so a larger percentage. And there we do see a distinction where men are more likely than women to attend religious services, driven in large part by these patterns we see among Orthodox Jews. And then internationally, just looking at other Muslim groups that we've seen, we've done polling in probably about 40 different other countries. And there, compared to many other countries, the United States, Muslims in the United States are more inclusive. The mosques in the United States are more inclusive than in many other countries. The share of women in the United States who say they attend religious services weekly is about 10 points lower than for men. If you look at in Bangladesh, for example, it's a 76-point gap. If you look in Malaysia, it's a 68-point gap. If you look in Turkey, it's a 48-point gap. So there are even larger groups, even larger gaps, even larger sort of, even fewer women sort of attending religious services in many of these other countries that we've polled in than we see in the United States. Although we do, of course, see that significant gap in the United States. So I'll stop there. And so we can move on to the question and answer. I see we're getting lots of questions kind of popping up, so I look forward to hearing that.
Thank you, Dr. Mohamed. I want to, before we turn to questions, I just want to give Dr. Bagby a chance to kind of give us some of his reflections. Having done this research now for 2 decades, this is the 3rd report. What do you see as the most urgent priorities to address in the coming decade? Dr. Bagby, you're still muted. Still muted.
Okay, I'm an old man, so.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. Well, we are starting the transition to a new generation. People like me, I wouldn't count any of y'all in that category, but you know, so many of the pioneers are aging, and we are starting to transition to a new era of Islam in America. You know, I've charted 3 eras of Islam in America, and we are on the verge of starting the 4th era, where the founders and the founder generation is passing and a new generation. And any sociologist will tell you that an organization, a movement, if you will, is in its most dangerous position in generational transition. And so one of the reasons why we have to focus on masjids, because all the studies basically show that if there is no sense of connection to a house of worship, whether a church or synagogue, the likelihood of that person straying from the faith is high. If there is a sense of connection in a person to their house of worship, there is a much greater chance that they will retain their faith. So that is why masjids have to up their game, in particular when it comes to young adults, because that is the next generation, and women and converts. So Dalia, of course, I had such a great time working with her and ISPU on the inclusive mosque study, making Muslim spaces, and that study, I would encourage everybody to look at that study. You know, mosques need to become more inclusive and more relevant. Those are the 2 key words. And to me, the report too just shows what I said earlier, that we're on the right path. We are not in a problem. We are not, you know, in the negative. We're in the positive, but we just have to up our game to the next level.
Thank you. Thank you for that hopeful message. We're going to go now to the questions we've gotten, a lot of engagement, so that's wonderful. Let's see, let's start with, some of these questions have already been answered, but let me start with Sumayya's question. This is really targeted to anyone who'd like to answer, but especially Dr. Matson. What message would you tell the women who feel tired of having to fight for basic rights at their masjid and decide to do the work somewhere else, a third space or other institutions? What do you say to folks who have given up on their masjid?
Right. Well, there are a few things. I would say I understand that, and sometimes you can't change an institution. Sometimes that's just the reality, and you may have to put your energy somewhere else, just for your own mental health, for your own spiritual health. You may need to do it, but there's no space on this earth that is free from us and our own human failings, right? So we shouldn't be seeking that perfect space or that utopia, because as soon as we do that, then we actually have a dystopia, because we're going to ignore the kind of problems that are happening within that space. We live on this earth, and this is a place of struggle. But we do want to have a home, right? We as we're struggling with so much, we need a home where mostly we're accepted and not being judged all the time. So I want to make a difference there. Doesn't mean that our home will be a place without some conflict, but it should be a place where we don't always have to like struggle just to be who we are and not judge. And this is why I'd like to just point out the statistics about African-American mosques. I mean, I want us to think very deeply about this. Why do women who attend African-American mosques feel that they are friendly, more friendly to them. And, you know, we would have to study it more deeply, but my feeling is that when I've spent a lot of time, very often African-American mosques have been my mosques when I was living in south side of Chicago and in Hartford, Connecticut. Like I felt that I was going to a place that was primarily for us, right? Our gaze wasn't on how we appeared to others. And this is where I think there's a balance with like the political and civic activity and all these other things. Those are important, but I don't want us to always be thinking about what others think about us. I want us to care first and foremost about each other. And that's how I always felt when I attended African-American mosques. And I have not always felt that when I attended, you know, the other mosques. So I do think we need to talk about what is this space for, okay? Like, what is that space for? And sometimes we just need to keep struggling and keep working away at it. And sometimes we will need to step outside and we will need to step away for our own mental and spiritual health. And in those cases, you know, we also can have an influence on the broader society and on those other institutions when they see that they're losing people.
If I could add just one thing about the
Yes.
African-American, I think, you know, the much of the praise needs to go to Imam Mohamed, who, you know, very clearly preached.
Dr. Bagby?
You froze on us, Dr. Bagby.
Okay, while we fix that problem, I do want to move to a different question. There's a question here actually by Hind Mekki, who of course has done a lot of work on women's role in the masjid. She asks, what's the study, was the study able to look at how COVID-19 restrictions limited women's access to the mosque? And do the panelists have thoughts on how COVID has impacted women's mosque experiences in the last year? So just one point of clarity, the study was done before the lockdown. So it did not address the COVID-19 issue or restrictions, but I'd be interested in, you know, your thoughts, the panelists' thoughts on the issue of COVID-19 restrictions. And just one heads up, we are doing a series of articles on the impact of COVID-19 on the Muslim community, including access to sacred spaces. So be on the lookout for that.
But if I could just jump in a little and with one point, one thing that we've seen generally true in the Muslim community, but also more broadly among other religious groups, is an increase in sort of streaming, sort of web, sort of televised, for lack of a better word, religious services. So that was something that actually was relatively uncommon in Muslim spaces, you know, a few years ago. And just in the last year or so, we've seen a pretty significant sort of uptick in that. And so there's been more access in that way, because it's you can get access to the khutbah, not the entirety of the service, of course, but the khutbah at least, without having to negotiate some of the issues that some people encounter going into the space itself. So for at least some people, that's been an opportunity to gain, because there's this sort of democratization of, well, I can just go and look and hear this this knowledge, this information, this reminder, without having to deal with the way people are looking at me when I walk in, or these other, can I even see the imam? Well, I can see him just fine if I'm looking at my computer screen. Whereas if I'm, in a room that maybe the screen doesn't work, maybe the microphone doesn't work, maybe. So that's one thing that we've seen, as I said, in Muslim spaces as well as in other religious spaces.
Also, can I just say that one thing I found really interesting is that many organizations started having, they didn't have Juma, but on Fridays they would offer a lecture or a sermon, a religious talk given by women as well as men, because it wasn't strictly the Juma, it wasn't a Juma, so it was possible to do that. And I found that really interesting, that people in our community had greater access to the spiritual teachings of women religious leaders in our community. I just wonder if and when we all go back, if that will be something that might continue.
Yes, I have noticed that as well. I know Friday Gems is a program that Celebrate Mercy puts on, and they feature women regularly on that. And it's not quite a khutbah, but it certainly is at the same time as a khutbah might be. So I want to go ahead and keep moving through these questions as we wait for Dr. Bagby to come back. So one question by a gentleman named Mike Orton. In 2014, there was a documentary titled Unmosqued, discussing how Muslim youth aren't attending masjid. Did the study find something similar, or did it contradict the unmosqued findings? I can begin to answer that. So first of all, the Unmosqued documentary was the catalyst for us to do our research, the project called Reimagining Muslim Spaces, which was also led by Dr. Bagby. I encourage you to take a look at that, because what we aim to do for that study is to address all of the issues highlighted by the Unmosqued documentary. As for if these issues were highlighted, or were they, if this study looked at the young people attending the mosque, it did address it. And while young people are in the Muslim community are far more likely than their generational peers to attend a mosque, it's still lower than their elders. And so there are specific recommendations in our RMS study, Reimagining Muslim Spaces, on how to make the masjid a more conducive place for young people. And the most important thing is to basically get out of their way, is to empower them to create their own programming. They are phenomenally creative, and the places that allow and make space for them to create their own programming, they have the strongest show of young people at the masjid. Anyone else want to add to the issue of young people and the masjid? Okay.
I was just going to say it can be, new Muslims come from all different age groups. Often new Muslims are in a younger age group, and I was very troubled to see that there is such a low percentage of regular programming for new Muslims in mosques. That shows, again, I mean, if we compare, say, programming for new Muslims compared to interfaith programs, again, are we almost too external focused rather than internal focused sometimes? And so I do think a lot of young Muslims, they also bring their friends from time to time. And so I think to some extent those things can be related. And again, let's think about those numbers, about what kind of numbers are desirable in terms of young people coming to the mosque, because it's not just about the future. Let's just think about people as they are, where they are today and what they need. That space, that fellowship, that dignity, a place where they don't have to explain themselves. It's so important, especially when there are so many pressures. So I do hope that we begin giving more, more weight to the real needs of those who are within our community.
Thank you, Dr. Matson. This one, Dr. Bagby, I think you can address. Is there any information on the ethnically polarized mosques? This has been a trend in the last 10 years, mosques that are more ethnically homogenous. Is there growth in these or not? We unfortunately can't hear you, Dr. Bagby. All right, I'll move to a question that I think is important for Dr. Matson as well, regarding what I have actually seen firsthand, which is a situation where it's women who are sabotaging other women in their role in the masjid. For example, this is the questioner asks, I was once asked to provide a list of all sisters volunteering and their qualifications by sisters committee. So when they saw women volunteering, they wanted to know what their qualifications were, but they didn't ask about the brothers volunteers and their qualifications. And when we did encourage young leaders, there was a pushback from the sisters who were active in the past. So what are your thoughts, Dr. Matson, when the pushback against women's full inclusion is from other women?
Yeah, well, I don't think we should be surprised by this. I'm not a sociologist. It's not my training. I'm not a social scientist in any way. But from reading that I've done, any marginalized group will always have these dynamics, because it's like the idea of the good Muslim, bad Muslim. If a group as a whole is deemed to be troublesome or problematic, there will always be this tiny little door that only one or two people can slip through by presenting themselves as this, perfect model of morality and righteousness and better than all of the rest. I mean, we even have a problem with this in Islamic history, where if there was an extremely pious woman, they would say she was so pious, she had so much taqwa, she was like a man, right? So I really don't, I don't look at it as that. I don't blame those women. I mean, although we all are responsible for our own behavior, but the reality is that when these things happen, it shows that there's a systemic problem. It shows that women as a whole are being treated as less than, and as their presence in general is considered to be problematic, a problem to be managed. I think about that book, How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? About young Muslims in America. So Mustafa Bayoumi, I think.
Yes.
So I really think we have to look at it that way and turn the mirror back on all of us and say, why is it that women as a whole are considered to be a problem to be managed, so that there then becomes this kind of the only way to have voice is to separate yourself as a woman from all the other women.
Thank you, Dr. Matson. Dr. Bagby, hoping the technical issues have been resolved. Would you like to
Yeah,
comment?
just in time.
Yeah, just in time. The question was about the growth of ethnically homogenous mosques, and if you've seen that as a trend over the past 10 years.
Our study does not show that trend. Basically, it stayed the same, which is we charted that a masjid had one ethnic group if 90% of the attendees at Salatul Juma were of one ethnic group. And that percentage has stayed around 4, 5, 6% every decade. So no, I don't see that trend at all. In fact, I would say that masjids have remained very diverse. So no, I don't see that trend.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bagby. I love studies like this because they help, first and foremost, the Muslim community understand itself and get an accurate picture of who they are and the actual trends and how they compare to the wider society around them. So many of the misconceptions that I hear Muslims make about the masjid and about the trends that they perceive are kind of put to rest by this kind of study. And it also underscores where we still have a lot more work. So thank you so much for the phenomenal work you've done on this work, Dr. Bagby. Now, a follow-up email with resources and the webinar recording will be sent to everyone who registered. So please go ahead and feel free to share with your networks. And we value your feedback immensely. So please take a moment to take our poll that just launched. And finally, check out some of our upcoming webinars. So in October, we're going to do a focus on community development and issues pertaining specifically to conversations we don't usually have because we're so busy explaining ourselves to others. But this is going to be a focus on the community and on some of the challenges facing our community. So look for those educational opportunities in October. And then most importantly, join us for our annual banquet on October 2nd. Thank you very much for joining us today. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, ISPU.
Thank you so much to all our panelists.